This lesson covers how to change fractions to decimals to percent and then back again and vice versa. By now, you should know what a fraction is. You might even know how to reduce fractions, and you might even know that there is some kind of relationship between all three of these nice things. But we will cover them all in this lesson. The first thing I have on this slide is that you can convert fractions to decimal form by using division. And I'm going to stop here and I'm going to suggest that if you are watching this video and this is the first time that you are studying something like this, I would highly suggest taking out a notebook or a piece of paper, writing utensil, so that maybe you'd want to jot down some notes and maybe even do some of these questions along with me. So once again, our first point is you can convert fractions to decimal form by using division. It's possible that you already know that if I zoom in on this fraction here, that there's a really interesting relationship with this line here. It actually does divide the 4 and the 5 in this case. Fractions are in itself division. You can use this here as a division symbol if you wish. Now, what happens when we do that? What happens when we convert fractions to decimal form using division? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to whip out my calculator here, and I'm going to show you what happens if we do something like 4 divided by 5. Clear 4 divided by 5, which gives me 0.8. And that's how easy it is to figure out what a fraction is in decimal form. 0.8 is also a really nice decimal. It stops, we can see it, it's not too intimidating, and it's a pretty simple decimal. If we scroll here to the next fraction I have for us, which is 7/8, we're going to convert this to decimal form by doing division. So remember, this could also mean division. To change it into decimal form, we're going to do 7 divided by 8, which gives us a bit of a bigger decimal. You'll see here, it's okay. We still see the end of this decimal. It's a bit bigger than the first one that we got, which was 0.8, but it's still manageable, and we have done what we had said we would want to do, which was divide our fractions to convert it into decimal form. The last example that I have for us here is 21 divided by 32, 21/32, which I'm going to divide the numerator by the denominator, and I get a pretty big decimal in comparison to all of the other ones. So a huge word of caution here. You're not always going to get nice decimals. In my class, I like to encourage rounding to the nearest hundredth. If you can do it, if you know how to do it, go for it. In my class by now, you should know how to round to the nearest hundredth. So something like this decimal over here, we're going to round to 0.66. If we wanted to, you could write something like this, or because we are rounding, instead of putting an equal sign, because it's not exactly equal to 66, we can put these nice little lines here, which means approximately. I mean, if we really wanted to. I'm not a huge stickler on these symbols, but you should know what they mean. So we have now converted all of our fractions into decimal form, and we've done that by dividing our numerator by the denominator, because that line does imply division. So now we're going to continue, now that we know how to convert our fractions to decimal form, we're going to continue by now converting our decimals to percent. And we're going to do this by multiplying our decimals by 100. But I do want to talk about this. I want to talk about the word percent. In French, and I'm teaching in Quebec, so in French, this word here is cent. And that should help you know what the English word is. Cent in English means 100. Per 100, if you will. Let me spell that correctly. Per 100. And that gives you an idea in itself what percents deal with. Percents really like the number 100. In order for us to convert our decimals to percent, we always need to multiply our percents by 100. It's possible that you've done this when you're calculating how much of a percentage you have got on an exam or on a test or on a quiz. And all you're going to do is you're going to take your decimal, which is 0.8, and you're going to multiply that by 100. Now, yes, you could take your calculator and do this, but this is a kind of fascinating thing. where if you have 2 zeros here, you're actually going to move this wonderful decimal over 2 spots to make it a bit bigger, right? Because you're multiplying it by 100, you're making this 0.8 a lot bigger. So what you're going to do is you're going to move the decimal place over 2 times. And I'm going to show you how I do this by rewriting it and then putting some little spaces. Where my decimal is now going to be here, I'm sure you can guess what it is that I'm going to add here. I'm going to add a 0. And that means that 0.8 in a percent, you multiply that by 100, moving your decimal place over 2 times, which gives us 80%. Of course, you could use a calculator if you have it on hand, but it's also very simple for you to know 2 zeros, move it over 2 decimal places, and make it a bigger number, 80%. So let's look at the other one we got from the first slide. The other decimal that we got was 0.875. So once again, we're supposed to take this number, or this decimal, sorry, and we're going to multiply it by 100. That's how you convert it to percent, %. And what we're going to do is, yes, you can take a calculator, but what I would like to show you is that, again, 2 zeros means that you're going to move this over 2 times. And now it's possible that you don't really understand what it means to be moving this over 2 zeros. Maybe you haven't converted measurements yet, but it's a cool little trick for you to know. And so instead of having our decimal over here, our decimal is actually going to end up being between the 7 and the 5. And that's okay. You can have an 87.5%. No worries. And we'll stop there for this one. The third one that we found on the first slide, we rounded. We rounded it to 0.66. So we're actually going to use this number because that's what we got in the first slide to convert to percent. And all we're going to do once again is we're going to take our 0.66, we're going to multiply it by 100. And you can again take your calculator, or because we have 2 zeros, we can move our decimal place over 2 places, 66%. And our decimal is like here hiding, but you don't need to put it. And that's how you convert decimals to percent. So not so bad, not so difficult. You just really have to multiply the decimal that you got by 100 to get the percent. And I know that you're probably thinking maybe right now, well, what happens if, we are given the fraction and you ask me to go to percent? Well, of course, it's easier for you to go from a fraction to a decimal to a percent. We're going to talk about that a little bit more at the end of this lesson. If we continue on to my next slide, the last thing that we need to talk about is that we can actually convert percent back all the way around into a fraction. And if I go back here, you'll notice that I have this little circle going on here where you can go this way, but you can also go this way. I'm going to follow this alignment that I have for us here. So what we're going to do is, now that we know how to convert things from fractions to decimals to percent, what happens if you're given a percentage and I say change it into a fraction? So again, the key word here is always cent. It's always 100, per 100. And what we're going to do is we're literally going to rewrite these beautiful percents here into a percent fraction. And what does that mean? And I keep going to my colors here, so I'm going to change my color. This is 80 per 100. Another way that we can write that is per 100. And that's how easy it is. Now, in my class, you've seen this actually. This is also known as fractional notation. If we're talking about notations of number, this is another way of saying fractional notation. However, you now probably know that you can reduce this. You can reduce this. It's very, very a good thing to know is to reduce fractions. In our case, we have 2 numbers that can be reduced pretty significantly. I feel like the first thing people are going to say is, well, both 80 and 100 can divide by 10. For sure, you can divide 80 by 10 and 100 by 10, and you'll get something that looks like this. But then you'll also notice that you can go a little bit further, because then you can divide both 8 and 10 by 2, and so you get 4 out of 5. This is the reduced version of 80% in a fraction form, or in a fraction notation. But the first thing and everything that we're going to do to start with is we're always going to take our percent and we're always going to put it over this 100. And so keeping that in mind, let's go over here. And I know that what you're probably thinking is, okay, what am I supposed to do here with a percent? you have 87.5 over 100. Now, in this case, you're probably wondering, well, is that okay? Can I do this? In my class, I say it's okay that, yes, you can do this. It's weird for you to see a decimal in the numerator. Now, if you wanted to, we can go a little bit further and say that this is 87 over 100 and a half. I mean, you could easily have written it out like this. It's okay if you don't. I just kind of want to see what you do when you're given a percentage and change it into a fraction. More often than not, though, for the purpose of this course, you're not going to see a decimal as a numerator. And so we're just going to shift on over to 66%, which is, again, very easy. We're going to do 66 over 100 because it's 66 per 100. You can keep it like this, but you could also, in my class, I encourage reducing. And usually the first thing people are going to think of is that you can reduce both 66 and 100 by 2. So if I were to divide this by 2 and divide this by 2, you would get 33 over 50. And that is the reduced form of this percentage into fraction form. And so now we know what to do when we can convert a percent into a fraction. But one thing that I really want to talk about is that sometimes it depends on the person, but it's always easier for some to convert to different forms if they just write everything out. Because some people are more comfortable converting one way versus the other. And it's also helpful to have everything written out in front of you. So what we're going to do is we're going to fill out this beautiful chart that I have here. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this lesson, if you really wanted to, you could always have a piece of paper or a notebook, and you can always do this with me. It's helpful if you do, and then you can kind of have your own little notes. What we're going to do is we're just going to fill out this table, and we're obviously going to start with the first row, where I have given you in here a 0.83 decimal form. So it's up to you what you prefer to change it into. You could either prefer, if you prefer, you could change it into a fraction first, you could change it into percent first. It really doesn't matter at the end of the day. But I hope that you know that if you're going to go this way, you would have to do 0.83 times 100, which in this case gives us a nice 83%. Or you can go back down this way and say, oh, 83 is 83%, sorry, 0.83 is 83%, and that helps me start off what my fraction is going to look like. And I'm just going to put 83 over 100. And that's actually the reduced form for this case. The next one is a 3 over 5. So I don't really know off the top of my head, and maybe you don't either because you've just started doing this, but I don't actually know what 3 out of 5 is in a decimal form, maybe. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take out my calculator and I'm going to do 3 divided by 5, which gives me a very nice decimal of 0.6. Which is easy for me because I've been doing it, but 0.6 is the same thing as 60% if I do this times 100, moving my decimal place over 2 times, and you get 60%. For the next one, I have 51%. And now again, it's up to you. Maybe you're comfortable. Maybe you're like, I know that this is going to look like this. I know that it's going to look like this. Or maybe you don't, and you want to maybe convert it to fraction first, because you know that 51 over 100 is the fractional form of this percent. And then you might be comfortable and say, you know what, I'm going to actually take out my calculator and do 51 divided by 100, because I'm not sure what it's like in decimal form. And that's fine, and you should get 0.51. And our last example here is a 6 over 7. And again, don't really know what that is off the top of my head, but I know that it's going to be easier for me to go straight to a decimal form. So I'm going to do 6 divided by 7, and I get a really large decimal. That's fine. Once again, we're going to convert it to 2 decimal places. So we're going to round it to the nearest hundredth. And just because I had taught it to you earlier in this lesson, I'm going to put these little approximate signs, and I'm going to write here 0.86 because we're rounding up to the nearest hundredth. So that's done. Now I can take this 0.86, and I think that it's easier for me now to convert it to a percent by multiplying it by 100, and that gives me 86%. And so that's how you would convert from fractions to decimals to percents, and vice versa, back and forth. I do want to talk about equivalent fractions and what exactly this could help you with if you are doing equivalent fractions. Here are two really nice fractions that I've given you, 2 over 3 and 10 over 5. And I would love it if you could convert the following into decimal form. And because I've been telling you to maybe get out some paper, maybe get out some pencils to write it with me, I'm going to encourage you to pause this video and I'm going to encourage you to actually convert it into decimal form, figure out what you notice, and then press play on this video so that we can continue. So pause, convert these two fractions into decimal form, press play, and see what you get. If I take out my calculator and I do 2 divided by 3, I get a really big looking decimal. Now, very important actually is this line up here. So an added portion of this lesson could be that this line here tells us that 0.66 is something that repeats. Now yes, it stops at 7 on my calculator, but it does repeat. So you could write it like this, or you could write it like this if you decide to actually round it. Both are correct. So that's 2 over 3. What do you get if you do 10 divided by 15 now? Well, what do you know? You get the same thing, 0.66 or 0.67. You might have also already noticed, because you've done this before, that 2 over 3 and 10 out of 15 look like they are equivalent fractions. If I go this way, if I multiply both the numerator and the denominator by 5, I get the same 10 and 15. Or in the opposite way, if I were to divide 10 by 5, and I were to divide 15 by 5, you would notice that this is the reduced form of this fraction. Regardless, they both produce the same decimal when we divide. If you're not sure whether two fractions are equivalent or not, and it's not as easy for you to see it with your eyes, like it was for, say, 2 over 3, 10 out of 15, a really good way to check your work is to convert into decimal form. Two fractions are equivalent if they also produce the same decimal after you've divided the numerator and the denominator. And that's the end of this lesson. So I'm just going to go back to the first slide so we can review. You should now know that in order for us to convert fractions to decimals, we need to just divide the numerator by the denominator. Once we have our decimal, we can actually then multiply it by 100 to get the percent form of the fraction that gave us that decimal. You should also know that you can convert percentages into fractions with the help of the 100%. And by taking your percent and simply just putting it over 100. You could leave it that way, but more often than not, you're going to be asked to reduce the fraction. Finally, we did some exercises where we decided that we were going to convert from both fraction, decimals, and percents. Whichever way you preferred, whichever one you wanted to do first, it didn't matter. You decide what is easiest for you. And finally, there is a very, very helpful correlation between equivalent fractions and everything we've just learned. And one of the excellent ways is that you can always check to see if two fractions are equivalent because they have the same decimals. And at the same time, they would have the same percent. And that's the end of this lesson.